All right, so today we are going on a deep dive into the world of a 12th century thinker that you might not have heard of, but he had a huge impact on both the Islamic and Christian worlds, and his name is Ibn Rushd.
Ibn Rushd is such an interesting figure to me because he really embodies that idea of a polymath.
Okay, break it down for me. What makes him such a polymath?
Well, he wasn't just a philosopher, right?
Yeah.
He was also a physician for a time. He was a judge. He was a master of Islamic law.
There's nothing this guy couldn't do.
Yeah, like what didn't he do? He seemed to have done it all. And this is really important for understanding his philosophical work as well.
Gotcha. So let's talk about his philosophical work, because one of the things Ibn Rushd is really known for is his commentaries on Aristotle.
Oh, yeah, he was obsessed with Aristotle, like way before it was cool.
Like, what does that mean? Was he a fanboy, or was there something more to it?
I mean, maybe a little bit of fanboyism going on, but he was like the commentator on Aristotle.
Yeah.
So you've got Aristotle, this giant of philosophy, and then you've got Ibn Rushd, who comes along and writes these incredibly detailed commentaries on his work and really helps to revive interest in Aristotle's thought.
So these commentaries weren't just like, hey, here's a summary of Aristotle. They were like next level analysis.
Yeah, exactly. He was adding his own interpretations, his own insights, building on what Aristotle had started.
Wow, this Ibn Rushd guy sounds like he was operating on another level.
Oh, totally. And here's what's really fascinating. His commentaries weren't just influential in the Islamic world. They actually played a key role in reintroducing Aristotle to Christian Europe.
Whoa, wait, really? So we're talking major impact?
Major impact, like think Thomas Aquinas.
Oh, wow. Okay, yeah, he's a big name.
Right,
Sure.
huge figure in Christian theology. Well, he relied heavily on Ibn Rushd's commentaries to understand and interpret Aristotle.
That is wild. So this guy, Ibn Rushd, is bridging worlds, sparking intellectual revolutions, and it all starts with his obsession with some ancient Greek philosopher?
It's a testament to the power of ideas to transcend time and place.
For sure. But Ibn Rushd wasn't just a commentator. He was a philosopher in his own right. And he waded right into some of the biggest debates of his time.
Absolutely. And one of the most important ones that he tackles is this question of the relationship between faith and reason.
Oh, man, that is a debate that's still raging on today.
It's a classic. And Ibn Rushd, he jumps right into the ring with this treatise called the Decisive Treatise. And he's making this really bold argument.
What's the argument?
He says that reason and faith are not enemies. They're not opposed to each other.
Okay.
They're actually partners in the pursuit of truth.
Now, hold on a minute, because that sounds nice in theory. But how do you reconcile those two things? They seem like they're coming from completely different places.
So Ibn Rushd, he had this really nuanced view of how people approach truth. Okay, so imagine like a ladder, he says.
The ladder.
Yeah, at the bottom rung, you've got people who understand religion primarily through stories, through images, metaphors.
Okay.
Then as you go up a rung, you've got theologians who are using logic and reason to interpret religious texts. And then at the very top of this ladder, you have the philosophers who are using pure reason to grasp at the ultimate truths of the universe.
So is he saying that philosophers are like the ultimate truth seekers then?
Not necessarily. He's not saying one is better than the other. He's saying that each level of understanding has its own value and purpose.
Okay.
And he actually saw philosophers as having this unique ability to uncover the rational meanings that are kind of hidden within religious texts.
Okay.
So in his view, philosophers could use reason to show how faith and reason actually work together to give us a fuller understanding of the universe and our place in it.
Wow. That is a bold stance to take, especially back then. I mean, you're talking about a time and place where religion had a lot of power and authority.
Yeah. You're not wrong. Challenging the status quo tends to ruffle some feathers, and let's just say Ibn Rushd ruffled quite a few.
I bet he did. So last time we were talking about Ibn Rushd, this 12th century polymath who was like a rock star of philosophy.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that he ruffled some feathers with his ideas. So who were some of his biggest critics?
Well, so one of the most famous critics that Ibn Rushd had was another really prominent Islamic thinker named Al-Ghazali.
Okay.
And Al-Ghazali had written this book called The Incoherence of the Philosophers.
Catchy title.
Right. And in it, he basically argues that philosophy, and in particular the works of earlier thinkers like Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina, they actually lead to like wrong conclusions about God and the universe and are really incompatible with Islam.
He just called out like philosophy as a whole.
Yeah, he was like dropping the mic on philosophy.
So how did Ibn Rushd respond to that? Because this Al-Ghazali guy Sounds like he was a pretty big deal.
Oh yeah, Al-Ghazali was a huge, a major figure in Islamic thought. So this wasn't just some minor criticism Ibn Rushd was facing,
Right.
but Ibn Rushd was not one to back down from an intellectual challenge.
I would expect nothing less from this guy.
So he sits down and he writes his own treatise in response to Al-Ghazali.
Yeah.
And get this, he calls it the incoherence of the incoherence.
Oh,
Right back at you, Al-Ghazali.
so he's basically like, no, you're wrong, and I'm going to prove it.
Exactly. He's like, hold my beer. I'm going to dismantle your arguments point by point.
I'm here for this philosophical showdown.
Oh, yeah, it's epic. So they're debating stuff like the nature of the universe.
Okay, let's wait.
Like, is the universe eternal or did it have a beginning? How does God's knowledge work? What are the limits of human reason?
These are some big questions.
Huge Al-Ghazali was coming from this place of saying, look, we have to rely on revelation from God because our human reason is just too limited to understand these things.
Okay.
But Ibn Rushd is pushing back and saying, no, actually, we can use logic and reason to understand even these really complex theological ideas. And he argues that philosophy can actually lead us to a deeper understanding of both God and the universe.
So for Ibn Rushd, studying the natural world wasn't about rejecting God. It was about getting closer to God.
Exactly. He saw science as a way of appreciating the wonders of creation. Like, the more you understand the natural world, the more you can marvel at God's design.
That's amazing, and I love how he's bringing those two things together because it's so easy to fall into the trap of thinking that science and religion have to be at odds with each other.
Right, and Ibn Rushd is like, nope, they can actually work together.
Okay, so we've talked about this big debate between Ibn Rushd and Al-Ghazali, but you mentioned earlier that this debate had implications that went way beyond just the Islamic world.
Absolutely. Remember how we said that Ibn Rushd was a huge deal in Christian Europe?
Yeah.
Well, his defense of philosophy in the incoherence of the incoherence, it actually had this ripple effect that reached all the way to Europe and influenced the development of scholasticism.
Scholasticism. Remind me what that is again?
So scholasticism was this really important movement in medieval Christian Europe where thinkers were trying to reconcile faith and reason using logic and philosophical inquiry, and they were really grappling with the works of Aristotle.
Got it. Okay.
And Ibn Rushd's work lands in the middle of all of this.
Perfect timing.
And his arguments about the relationship between faith and reason, they really resonated with these scholastic thinkers.
That's incredible. So this one debate between two Islamic thinkers ends up having this huge impact on both the Islamic and Christian worlds.
It just goes to show you how ideas can transcend boundaries of time and culture.
Totally.
Yeah.
But now I'm dying to know more about this whole active intellect concept that you mentioned earlier, because that sounds like where things get really wild.
Oh, yeah. Buckle up, because we're about to get into some mind-bending territory.
Okay, hit me with it. What is the active intellect?
So basically, Ibn Rushd was really intrigued by this idea from Aristotle that there's this universal intelligence, this cosmic mind that we all tap into when we're learning.
So it's like instead of each of us having our own individual minds that die when we do, we're all connected to this one giant mind.
Exactly. It's like this shared pool of knowledge and understanding that we can all access.
That's such a trippy concept. I kind of love it.
Right. And it was a pretty radical idea for the time, especially because it went against what a lot of other thinkers like Ibn Sina believed.
What did Ibn Sina think?
So Ibn Sina, he believed that we have these individual souls that are eternal and separate from our bodies.
Oh, wow. Okay, so very different perspectives.
Yeah, Ibn Rushd was shaking things up with this active intellect concept.
I bet he was. And I'm guessing that not everyone was thrilled about it.
You're catching on this idea of the active intellect. It actually became a really big deal in Europe where they called it Averroism.
Averroism. I'm sensing some controversy brewing here.
Oh yeah, Averroism ended up causing quite a stir in medieval intellectual circles.
Yeah.
Especially because it raised all sorts of questions about the immortality of the soul, which was kind of a big deal for the church.
Yeah, I can imagine that didn't go over too well with the church authorities.
Not so much. But even though it caused controversy, Averroism really took off and became a major force in European intellectual life.
So last time we left off with this cliffhanger about Averroism and how Ibn Rushd's ideas about the active intellect were causing a stir in Christian Europe.
Right, because this idea that we're all tapping into this one universal mind, it really challenged the church's doctrine about individual souls and the afterlife.
Yeah, that's a pretty fundamental belief to be messing with. So what happened? Did they just like excommunicate anyone who even mentioned Ibn Rushd's name?
Well, it wasn't quite that dramatic, but it definitely caused some major tension. But here's the thing that I find so fascinating about Ibn Rushd's story. His influence in the Islamic world and his influence in Christian Europe. They kind of had these opposite trajectories.
What do you mean?
So while his ideas were sparking these huge debates and controversies in Europe back in the Islamic world, his influence was starting to fade a bit.
Really?
Why is
I
that?
thought his whole defense of philosophy and reason would have made him a legend.
You'd think so, right. But remember those conservative theological movements that were gaining power around that time?
Yeah.
Well, they weren't exactly fans of Ibn Rushd's ideas, especially his embrace of Aristotle.
So even though he engaged in these really important debates and pushed Islamic thought forward, he wasn't able to single-handedly change the whole course of Islamic intellectual history.
Exactly. It's more like he planted these seeds of thought that continued to be debated and discussed for centuries to come.
Okay, so his influence back home is kind of fizzling out. But meanwhile in Europe, it's like a wildfire. How does that happen?
It's like the perfect storm of timing and circumstance.
Yeah.
You've got all these scholars in places like Paris and Italy who are rediscovering the works of Aristotle,
Right.
and they're wrestling with these really complex philosophical ideas, trying to make sense of them within the context of Christian theology, and then boom, Ibn Rushd's commentaries on Aristotle, they land on the scene.
Talk about making an entrance.
Right. It was perfect timing because
Yeah.
these scholars, they were hungry for new perspectives, new interpretations, and here comes Ibn Rushd arguing that faith and reason, they don't have to be at odds with each other.
It's like he was handing them a whole new set of tools to unpack the universe.
Exactly. And this is how Averroism really takes root and flourishes in these European intellectual circles.
So what were some of the key ideas that these Averroists latched onto?
One of the big ones was this idea of the double truth.
Double truth. Sounds intriguing.
So basically, it's this idea that something can be true philosophically, but not necessarily theologically.
Okay, take the fall.
So, you can use reason and logic to arrive at certain truths about the world, but those truths, they don't invalidate or contradict the truths revealed by faith.
So it's like saying there are different ways of understanding truth.
Precisely. And this idea was huge because it gave these Christian thinkers a way to engage with the philosophical arguments without having to throw out their religious beliefs.
It's so clever.
Right, and it allowed them to really grapple with some of those thorny philosophical questions that Ibn Rushd had raised without feeling like they were betraying their faith.
I bet that didn't make the church very happy, though.
Yeah, the church was not thrilled about this whole double truth business. They saw it as a slippery slope towards skepticism and heresy.
I can only imagine the church leaders were freaking out a little bit.
Oh, yeah. They tried to condemn these Averroist ideas, but it was like trying to put out a wildfire. The more they tried to suppress it, the more it seemed to spread.
Ibn Rushd, the ultimate agent of chaos.
Right. And it's ironic because even those who disagreed with Ibn Rushd, like Thomas Aquinas, who we mentioned earlier, they couldn't just ignore him
Why not?
because he was just too important. He was the Aristotle expert, and his arguments were too well crafted, too insightful to just brush aside.
So in a way, he was forcing these Christian thinkers to step up their game, to really examine their own beliefs and come up with stronger arguments.
Exactly. He was raising the bar for theological debate and pushing everyone to think more critically.
It's amazing to me how one thinker living in 12th century Spain could have such a profound and lasting impact on the intellectual history of both Islamic and Christian worlds.
It just goes to show you the power of ideas to transcend boundaries of time and place. Ibn Rushd's story is a testament to the idea that engaging with challenging ideas, even if they come from different cultures or time periods, it can open up these whole new ways of seeing the world and ourselves.
And that's why we do this show, right? To explore these big ideas and hopefully walk away with a little bit more understanding and a lot more questions.
Absolutely. And maybe even a little bit of inspiration to go out and do some exploring of our own.
Totally. So next time you stumble across a name you don't recognize or an idea that seems foreign or strange, don't shy away from it. Embrace that curiosity because you never know where it might lead.
Well said. I couldn't agree more.
That's all the time we have for today's deep dive, but thank you so much for joining us on this journey through the fascinating world of Ibn Rushd.
It was my pleasure.
And to all of you listening out there,
Ah.
keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those brain cells firing until next time.